Welcome back. We are in Genesis chapter 30. This is actually episode number 100 of the podcast episodes we've been uploading just centered on Christ. So certainly cool to have hit that milestone, 100 episodes. And today it's an interesting lesson, an interesting chapter in Genesis chapter 30. There is a lot of family rivalry, a lot of sibling rivalry, fighting and rivalry between father-in-law and son-in-law, between sisters, between wives. Just sort of a chapter where it's as if everybody is out to get the other person. And so we get into Genesis chapter 30 together. There are some chapters in the Bible that you might say they would play very well as a soap opera. Genesis chapter 30 is that chapter, is one of those chapters. So beginning in Genesis 30, verse 1 through 24, focuses on the rivalry, the competition that's happening between sisters, Leah and Rachel, both of whom are married to Jacob. Beginning in Genesis 30, verse 1, it says, "Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, 'Give me children, or else I die.' And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel. And he said, 'Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?'" A theme that we keep seeing and we will continue to see in Genesis, one that keeps coming up, is God's blessing upon someone causing envy in other people. Now, Rachel's outburst here seems a bit dramatic until we understand that during ancient times, during these times in this culture, a wife, a woman who could not give birth to children, was considered a social disgrace. And so she is disgraced from a social standpoint. And so she is tired of being seen in that way. So you can understand why she feels that way. But the sobering irony of her statement, "Give me children or else I die," is that later on, in Genesis 35, verse 16 through 19, giving birth to her second son, Rachel does in fact die giving birth to that son. So that's a sobering bit of irony there in her statement. Now, something else that stands out here is that while Isaac, you might remember, had prayed to God on his wife's behalf, that's back in Genesis 25, verse 21, at least as far as we have recorded, Jacob does not do this. Now, Jacob knows that God is sovereign over life. In fact, that's reflected in when he tells Rachel. But for whatever reason, at least as far as we have recorded, he does not take Rachel's barrenness before God. Maybe Jacob is feeling some bitterness toward God. Remember, God had said that he would be with Jacob, but now Jacob is here in this land, and he's been deceived by his father-in-law, and now his favorite wife cannot have children. So maybe Jacob is feeling like, I don't know that God's holding up his end of the bargain here. Maybe. That's a perhaps. God, though, wants Jacob and Rachel to realize that they need to turn to him in their hopeless situation, but it seems neither of them does. And so, Rachel proposes a solution to this problem. She says, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go in to her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." Then she gave him Bilhah her maid as a wife, and Jacob went in to her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged my case, and he also has heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Jacob and Rachel repeat the same mistake that Abraham and Sarah made all the way back in Genesis 16 when Sarah gives Abraham her handmaid Hagar. Now, what Rachel does here is she intends to adopt her handmaid's children, which will make them her own children. So Dan becomes the adopted son of Rachel. The first son born to Bilhah was named Dan, and Dan means judged. Rachel here feels judged, or she feels vindicated by God. See, I had a son. I did what God wanted me to do. and God has vindicated me against all the social disgrace and the insults that have been brought my way. That's what his name means. Now, again, continuing on, Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. Bilhah has another son. Rachel names him Naphtali, which refers to Rachel's struggle with her sister Leah. Are we beginning to pick up on the bitter feelings between Rachel and Leah? Rachel is naming her children, and their names basically mean, and they point to the fight that's going on between Rachel and Leah. This is a deep-seated bitterness and hatred between these two sisters who are both married to Jacob. And remember, all of this bitterness and hatred grew out of lies and deception. By Laban, Rachel and Leah's father and Jacob's father-in-law, by Laban, but also by Jacob. Because the whole reason he's in this position is because of his own deception back home when he deceived his father Isaac. So lies and deception are the root of all of these problems right now. When Leah, continuing on in the text, she's paying attention to this. When she saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her to Jacob as wife, and Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, a troop comes, so she called his name Gad. Despite having 4 sons of her own, not adopted sons, but 4 sons of her own, Leah becomes intensely jealous of Rachel's adopted sons, and so she does the same thing. She gives her maid to Jacob and adopts her maid's children as well. And the first son she names Gad, which means a crowd or an army, probably referring to now she has this crowd of sons around her. And then Leah's maid, Zilpah, bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. The second son's name, Asher, it means happiness or prosperity. So there's this back and forth now. Rachel has these 2 adopted sons through her handmaid. Leah has 4 sons of her own and now 2 adopted sons through her handmaid. All this back and forth, this bitterness between, this jealousy between sisters. And just when you thought that nothing crazier could happen than these sisters naming their children based upon their jealousy and their fight with each other, something crazier does happen. The text says, Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest, and he found mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, Please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, Leah said to Rachel, Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. Okay, mandrakes. In ancient times, these mandrakes were thought to improve your love life and increase fertility. So it makes sense then why Rachel asked for them. She still has not had any children of her own, and she is looking for anything that might possibly help. Maybe mandrakes will help improve her being able to conceive a child. And she asks, hey, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But Leah's reply to Rachel is bitter, and it's full of sarcasm. Basically says, she asked Rachel, Are you going to take away the mandrakes my son found like you took away my husband? It's a very similar response to what Esau said back in Genesis 27, verse 36, when Jacob had taken away his blessing through deception. So it's this bitter sarcasm in response to Rachel. And Rachel, she buys or she purchases the mandrakes from Leah by allowing Leah to spend the night with Jacob. It seems that Rachel either has full control or she has a lot of say-so over who spent the night with Jacob and how often that happened. Leah's response, it may it may indicate that Rachel had completely shut off Leah's access to Jacob here. You've taken away my husband. So Rachel perhaps has completely shut Leah off from being able to spend time with Jacob. And so the arrangement is made, and Leah informs Jacob of what has happened. And so the text continues, God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. So that very night, Leah conceives and eventually has another son, names him Issachar, and his name basically means my payment. Leah saw Issachar as God essentially reimbursing her for giving her maid to Jacob. This is my reimbursement. God has given me another son. And then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Leah, so she has another son, names him Zebulun. His name is a reflection of God's blessing and also the hope that Jacob would start to favor her now that she has 6 sons. She also gives birth to a daughter named Dinah, whose name means justice. So then, after all of this, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So finally, God opens the womb of Rachel, and she gives birth to a son. And it seems finally she perhaps turns to God, because it says God listened to her. Perhaps it's just God listened to her as in he heard her suffering and her sorrow over having no children. Perhaps so it also means that Rachel finally turned to God. Perhaps both of those, it may be a little bit of both maybe. But she names him Joseph, which is a reminder of God taking away the reproach of her being childless. And also, it speaks to her hope of more sons from God. So, what we see is where deception and manipulation were tried and failed, God is the one who gives life. God is sovereign over life. And so the first 24 verses of Genesis chapter 30, it's this bitter rivalry between Rachel and Leah, this bitterness between them. The rest of the chapter, Genesis 30, verse 25 through verse 43, it speaks of how Jacob became wealthy, but it turns to yet another rivalry. But this one is between Jacob and his father-in-law, Laban. So it comes to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you. And Laban said to him, please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. And then he said, name me your wages, and I will give it. So after Rachel gives birth to Joseph, Jacob is ready to go home. He apparently has never heard anything from his mother, who was supposed to send word when Esau's anger had cooled off. Genesis 27, verse 43 through 44 tells us that. Apparently, he's never heard anything from Rachel. The few days had turned into years, had turned into, likely by this point, multiple decades. Their deception of Isaac and Esau cost them far more than they ever thought it would. There's a saying, you've maybe heard it before, but it goes something like this. Sin will take you farther than you wanted to go. It will keep you longer than you wanted to stay, and it will cost you more than you wanted to pay. Jacob has learned that by experience now. That deception has cost him far more than he ever thought it would. Now Laban, Jacob's wanting to go home, but Laban wants Jacob to stay around because he realizes how much better off he was financially with Jacob around. He asks Jacob to stay and essentially tells him to name your price. Now, Laban, up to this point, has always had the upper hand in negotiating with Jacob. But now, Jacob has the upper hand. Some think here that Laban, when he says he's learned by experience, could also be translated learned by divination. Now, that would fit with Laban having household gods, which we're going to read about in the next chapter in Genesis 31, verse 19. But either way, Laban says, look, I have learned, I do better. I'm better off with you here. So, hey, I'd really like to not see you leave. So, hey, tell me your price. What do you want me to pay you to get you to stay? And so Jacob says to Laban, you know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little and has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. And now, when shall I also provide for my own house? So he said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. These shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen, if it is with me. So Jacob here, he attributes the growth of Laban's wealth to the Lord as well. They both seem to realize that God is blessing Laban because Jacob is there. So Jacob then, he makes his offer. He says, I will continue to feed and to keep your flocks, Laban. And then what I will do, he proposes, is to go through Laban's flock and remove all the speckled and the spotted sheep and goats. Those would be his wages, his pay. Now, one commentator in studying and putting down these notes here, one commentator mentioned that these sheep and goats would have been around, the spotted and speckled ones, probably would have been around 20% of the herd, which was less than the typical commission of a shepherd during this time. So basically, Jacob is finally in the position of power from a negotiating standpoint, and he asked for less than what was commonly paid to people doing the job he was doing. So he doesn't try to get as much as he possibly can, but it seems he's actually asking for less than what is typically paid. Now, what we've come to know about Jacob's character is that up to this point, he is a liar and a manipulator who's only looking out for himself. But now, he doesn't take advantage of the position he's in. There seems to have, over the years of working with Laban and God's promise to him and depending on God, there has been a bit of a change in Jacob in the way that he treats other people. And so Laban responds to that. He says, oh, that it were according to your word. And so he, Laban, removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and he gave them into the hand of his sons. Then he, Laban, put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. So what Laban does is Laban says, hey, that sounds great. Let's do it. And then immediately afterward, Laban goes out that same day, and he removes all the speckled and spotted goats and lambs and gives them to his own sons. Before Jacob has a chance to claim his wages that they had agreed upon, Laban gives them away. Laban has defrauded Jacob, basically, is what's happened here. And then Laban puts 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. Laban has again manipulated his son-in-law and lied to him. But Jacob will have the last laugh, because what we're going to find out is this cheating of Laban, this lying, this essentially stealing by Laban, is not going to slow down the growth of Jacob's herd. And in fact, the 3 days distance between them will give Jacob a head start when he does decide to go home here in a few chapters. The text goes on. It doesn't say what Jacob was feeling at this point, but you can imagine how angry Jacob must have been. It says, "Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees. He peeled white strips in them and exposed the white which was in the rods. So he took some of the bark off. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, and the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then Jacob separated the lambs, and made the flocks face toward the streaked and all the brown in the flock of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves, and he did not put them with Laban's flock." So what's Jacob doing here? Jacob seems to believe that if the flock is looking at the multicolored branches, you've got the white underneath the bark there, but you also have, here's bark, here's white, you've kind of torn it up. It's speckled and spotted branch is what it would look like. He believes that if the flock is looking at these speckled and spotted branches, when they mate, then he thinks their offspring will also be speckled and spotted. Now, the Lord was clearly with Jacob, because you know as well as I do that that's not how this works. The Lord is clearly with Jacob, because with all the spotted and speckled animals removed from the flock, there would be typically few, if any, that would be spotted and speckled. We understand how that works. You have, you have two people with lighter skin complexion, people who I guess we commonly call them white. What do their children look like? Well, their children look like them. You don't have, a darker-skinned child coming from two lighter-skinned people. It's not how that works. It's sort of the same thing here. Laban has removed all the opportunity, basically just about all the chance for his herd having spotted and speckled animals. But we have the flock having spotted and speckled animals. Now, Jacob, he knows better than to keep his flock with Laban's flock. He's learned that lesson the hard way. And so Jacob keeps them separate. Laban's flock is over here, and over here on the other side, Jacob keeps his flock. He keeps them separated. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods, these multicolored branches, before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female, male servants, camels, and donkeys. So the stronger animals produced for Jacob, while the weaker produced for Laban. Also, notice how quickly Jacob's wealth grows. At the end of this chapter, he has camels, which were, you remember from a few chapters ago, camels were a status symbol of the wealthy. So he goes from this guy who is working for his father-in-law, seemingly not wealthy at all, being taken advantage of by his father-in-law, to now he becomes, after some time, exceedingly prosperous. He has status symbols of his wealth. And what we see from this chapter is that God is the source of this blessing in Jacob's life. Now, a quick lesson from Genesis chapter 30. Nothing and no one is powerful enough to thwart God's plan or promises. Jacob needs to increase his wealth in order to make the journey back home. He has to take care of his family somehow. He's got a huge family. This is a months-long journey back home. How are you going to take care of them? You have to have quite a bit of wealth to take care of your family on a long journey like this. But Laban is deceiving him at every step of the way, and yet God is still blessing Jacob. Remember, God had made a promise to bring Jacob back home, and God is going to keep that promise. That particular lesson is something we're going to see tested over and over again throughout the Scriptures. Will God keep his promise? And what we find is every time is yes, God keeps his promises. Now think about how important that particular lesson is to you and me. We are commanded to leave our old life behind, to die with Christ, and to be raised up to live a new life for him. being a living sacrifice, as Paul talks about in Romans 12:1 and 2, requires us trusting that God keeps all his promises. We are commanded to give up our whole old life and to live for God in this life. That is, you have to give up a lot. You have to sacrifice. You have to take up your cross every day, Jesus said in Luke 9:23. It requires sacrifice and commitment. That means we must be able to trust that God always keeps all of his promises. So we are seeing that example. We are seeing that we are reminded of that yet again here in Genesis chapter 30. God always keeps all of his promises. I appreciate you studying Genesis chapter 30 with me. Next time in Genesis 31, Jacob is finally going to make up his mind. It's time to go home. And some very interesting things are going to happen in Genesis chapter 31 as well. Hope you'll listen along with me to that episode as well. Until then, I hope you have a good rest of your day.